Human Rights Watch says that nearly 1/3 of African countries still deny pregnant girls and adolescent mothers their basic right to education. According to the rights group report released today, 10 African Union members have no laws or policies related to the retention of students who are pregnant or who are adolescent mothers in schools. Human Rights Watch reviewed over 100 laws and policies relating to education, gender equity strategies, and sexual and reproductive health policies and plans across the African Union. The report states that most African governments, however, now protect education access through laws, policies, or measures for pregnant students or adolescent mothers. Human Rights Watch calls on the AU to encourage all its members to respect, protect, and fulfill adolescents' rights to sexual and reproductive health. For a little bit more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Radhakrishnan, who's a reporter, author, and fellow Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Hello, thank you for having me. Good evening.
All right, so in your report, you say that a good number of African countries have enacted laws that protect girl children that are pregnant and their education. It's one thing to put statutes in the law books, but another to actually make them functional. What has been your observation?
Absolutely, I completely agree. And just as a little context, we've been conducting this research for a few years now and have found that each year across Africa, tens of thousands of adolescent girls drop out of school or experience discrimination and exclusion because they are pregnant, married, or are mothers. And we wanted to really have a comprehensive overview of the different legal protections and legal barriers that students face. As you mentioned at the outset, a vast majority, over 2/3 of countries, do have laws in some form or fashion that protect education. But implementation must be a priority, and it varies across those 2/3 of countries. It does not help these girls if school administrators, communities, and families are unaware of the processes for readmission into schools or continuing education or the protections that they have. Not all of the girls who drop out, those tens of thousands that I mentioned earlier, that face pregnancy-based discrimination, live in the 1/3 of countries that have legal barriers. This is an issue that individual governments must take action on, both by ensuring there are positive protections in place in the first instance, but also by committing to the implementation and monitoring at the school level. Now, our focus was primarily on documenting the different laws and policies that protect or hinder, but just to highlight that our partner is the Forum for African Women Educationalists, FAWE, have been doing great work reporting on implementation at country-specific regions. And Human Rights Watch will be publishing a report shortly specifically on the situation in Mozambique that gets this question as well.
You also raised concern about many states that just don't have guidelines, actually. And I wonder what that is. Is this a function of maybe cultural practices, religions, whatever orientation that those countries have? Is that what's making it difficult for them?
It varies. In the group of countries that we have found, about 1/3, 10 to 15, that have significant legal and policy barriers that girls face when they try to continue with their education. Some of it is derived from religious or cultural norms, perhaps around attitudes relating to adolescent sexual behavior. In some countries across Northern Africa and including Sudan, there are threats of criminal prosecution for girls, for anyone really who has sex outside of marriage. And that could be from all sorts of reasons. But in that context, a girl would simply not be able to go to school with a round pregnant belly. They would be under scrutiny for face possible criminal threat. It's simply unthinkable in that context for a girl to continue with their education. But in other countries where there are no clear policies at all, a policy gap, one of the main issues we found is that when a girl tries to continue with their education, there aren't clear procedures outlined for the school to follow. This means that school officials are often the key decision maker. They get to decide what happens to a pregnant girl in her education. And unfortunately, stigma, discrimination, stereotypes, gender stereotypes often play a role, and these girls are pressured or forced to drop out, or they face incredible challenges in readmission or continuing with school after they give birth.
I suppose also the schools traditionally were just never designed for girls that are pregnant, that probably have different health needs from other girls.
There's some aspects of that, but in fact, most contexts, most governments, most regions do have adequate resources in place, or existing support in place. Pregnant girls and young mothers often face barriers from social norms or community barriers, perhaps financial barriers or flexible class schedules. One example to which you might be hinting at is girls with young children often do need to be with their child or breastfeed their child. And there has been a long movement, a long practice, a great positive practice of allowing private breastfeeding rooms so that girls can step out, just like any student who has to use the restroom, to feed their child and return back to school. Return back to the classroom, really.
We often talk about gender equity. Women carry the children, but they don't get pregnant alone. And it seems that boys, men, get away scot-free, even though they were party to the pregnancy.
That certainly happens, and women often carry the brunt of the burden. There's a deep misunderstanding and a deep shift that we would like to see happen, where we do acknowledge how pregnancy occurs and an improvement around access to reproductive health services, a genuine understanding of the factors that lead to pregnancy. But on top of that, as you mentioned, there are inequities, there are unequal burdens. Pregnant students and young girls when they have a child, they're often viewed of as an adult in their own right. They face major challenges, including calls to stay at home, take care of the child, take on home care responsibilities. And that is certainly an unequal burden to place solely on a young girl who's become pregnant.
The African Union often comes together and looks at standardizing minimum rights, minimum privileges for citizens. And I just wonder, can a body like that assist girls across the continent to help them with their education? Could they play a fundamental role here?
Absolutely. And one of our main recommendations is to the African Union and its various committees and commissions to work with governments directly to move education systems to the full inclusion of girls in government public schools. One way this could happen is through the development and sharing of a model inclusive education policy or guidelines, the ideal human rights compliant guidelines, the processes and procedures that school officials and ministries of education should follow. The AU has a great role to play. They can lead on this issue. In fact, they should. There are shared goals in the Africa 2063 agenda in which to invest in the future of Africa, invest in education, invest in the youth to build development and human capital. And part of that commitment is to eliminate gender disparities at all levels of education.
We've been talking a lot about the authorities, but I suppose another aspect that needs to be considered and somehow managed are the parents of the children that are not pregnant, because they often, I guess, also have a pressure that they bring to bear, not wanting their child to go to the same school as children that are pregnant.
There's certainly much to do in terms of education. It's not a single solution that can solve this issue. There are so many interrelated concerns that come to ensuring that girls have equal futures and equal access to education. This includes working with communities and working with families, working on ensuring that all members involved in a child's well-being and development are aware of the different policies and rights in play. One of the most positive policies, as we mentioned earlier, there are quite a large number of countries, over 2/3, that do have positive practices in place, and there are positive policies that we can draw on. The African Union can draw on the positive policies of neighboring countries as well. And one of the great policies there outlines the responsibilities for the parents, for school management, and for a student welfare unit in supporting pregnant students and new mothers and reaching out to community members to ensure that students don't face pregnancy-based discrimination in school.
So what do you recommend from what you've found? What's the way forward?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So there are two main, the way I like to think about it, there are two main aspects to addressing this issue from a policy standpoint. In the countries where girls face significant legal and policy barriers to continue their education, be that from the lack of clear guidelines at the country level to criminal threats or exclusionary bans, review and revoke those barriers and implement positive protections. For the remainder of the countries that do have barriers, that have barriers from the school or community level, review the policies and work on implementation. Make sure that girls are allowed to remain in school for as long as they choose, that they're able to resume their education free from complex processes or bureaucratic processes for withdrawal and readmission. And ultimately support the students to make sure they can support these girls, make sure they can complete their education in school environments free from discrimination, and that they receive the support they need to stay in school.
Adi Radhakrishnan, that's where we'll leave it. Thank you so much indeed for joining us and giving us some very important background, and hopefully this is information that our authorities, our governments will work on. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
All right, that's Adi Radhakrishnan, who's with the Human Rights Watch Children's Rights Division, talking to us about protecting our young girls and teen mothers, adolescent mothers, continue with their education.